We're good. Okay, so good afternoon. We are picking up where we left off because we had the ambition of trying to get through all of Jewish history in 1 hour. It's going to take 1 hour and 20 minutes, so just a little bit more. But it's important for you to understand this historical arc before we talk about the second part of our when things went bad, which is something that's coming up with the date of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, which is just around the corner. So let's pick up where we left off. You may remember we were talking about the Crusades. We were talking about this change in the relationship between the Jewish people of Europe and the Jewish people of the Middle East and their host countries. Well, after this time period, when we get into the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, the relationship really begins to change in Europe. This becomes a time when there is rising nationalism, where people are thinking much more about their country, not just their king. They're thinking about their culture and their identity, not just who has the most soldiers. It's also a time of xenophobia. This is when people begin to really start to hate the outsider. I mean, yes, strangers were always a little suspicious throughout most of human history, but during this time it becomes almost a normal policy that people who are different, people who are strange, should be feared or hated. This is also a time with what's called religious fervor, where people are becoming more passionate about their religion in an external way. Of course, for the previous 2,000 years plus, people were always religious. I mean, going all the way back to the Egyptians. The Egyptians were religious, but religion was just a normal part of your culture. It was what you did. It wasn't something that would drive you to attack other people. Religious wars, like we saw in the Crusades, was kind of a new idea. You may remember when the Israelites fought their wars, they were not promoting Judaism. They were fighting for their defense and for their country. When you had other people fight throughout the Middle Ages, most of the time they were fighting to take more land, to get more money, to defeat another enemy. They weren't fighting for religion. At this time, you begin to get this passion about their religion that is becoming aggressive, that is becoming very external. This is going to lead to the Protestant Reformation, and it's also going to lead to the wars between Catholics and Protestants that is going to churn up all of Europe. Also at this time, there are many economic motivations that led towns to take away Jewish rights. Remember, we talked about Jews used to be merchants, Jews used to be traders, because most of the places we weren't allowed to own land. So we had other crafts that we could do. Well, now many of those jobs are going to the Christians, and they would rather make rules, make regulations that make it harder for Jews to compete. If you can create an unfair advantage, then it's much easier for your group of people to be successful. And so many Jews are being pushed out of the businesses they had been in. This is the beginning of a split in European Jewish history, where some Jews are able to survive this transition by taking the money that they had from being merchants and other things, thank you, and turning that into capital for new investments. This is where the stereotype of Jewish people being loan sharks, of loaning money, comes in, because if you're no longer able to be a merchant, what do you do with your pile of coins? You can't eat them. And if you do just use them to buy food, eventually you're going to have none left. So what people began doing was loaning the money, and then they would live off the interest they made from those loans. This was one of the few jobs left to some Jewish communities. Those people became wealthy. However, many other Jewish people, the majority, no longer had the same opportunities that they used to. And so they actually start becoming poorer and poorer than they used to be. You might say the Jewish middle class begins to disappear during this time period. This is where we also get the stereotype of Jews being poor and Jews being beggars and Jews being peddlers and junkmen and those kinds of things. That's also beginning during this time period. You'll notice how you have two stereotypes that are totally opposite, that were only the result of the European policies forcing Jews out of their old professions and trying to find some way to keep themselves alive. So we impoverish people, we isolate communities. Jews are then expelled from countries, England kicks out the Jews, many French towns kick out the Jews, many places in Germany kick them out, many of them invite them back in. This is going back and forth. And of course, in 1492, the most famous expulsion happens, which is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and then later from Portugal as well. And so what used to be one of the most vibrant and successful Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal are gone almost overnight. And this creates a huge problem for the Jewish world, and they end up spreading. This is the beginning of what we call Sephardic culture at the time, where Jews from that area bring their culture to North Africa and to Turkey and to Greece and to the land of Israel and other places. And so now they have a Spanish culture, Jewish culture, even though they're in these other countries. At the time, we also build what are called ghettos. Well, we don't build ghettos. The ghettos are built around us. Jews are now forced to live in certain neighborhoods. The towns build walls around them. There are gates, and those gates are locked. And of course, as the Jewish population does continue to grow, if you have a limited amount of space, it becomes a less and less enjoyable place to live. You build up, you build over the roads, it becomes harder and harder to live in those spaces. We doing okay? Okay, so you can see the trajectory is going down. This is not a happy time. At the same time, but back in the Middle East, because we shouldn't forget that a huge portion of Jewish population lives under Muslim rule, Islam is going through a decline. You may remember last week we talked about the golden age when Islam was cooperating with science, cooperating with poetry and literature and art, and Judaism was going right with them. And depending upon who your ruler was, life could be pretty good. You're still a second-class citizen, but it was a good second-class citizen, right? It was business class rather than economy. So that begins to change. That culture peaked around the 12th and 13th century, but the Mongols invaded, and although the Mongols also tried to invade, this is Genghis Khan, tried to invade Europe, they succeeded in invading the major centers of the Middle East. So places like Iran, Iraq, these are all overrun by the Mongol invasions. The Mongols do mostly end up becoming Muslim as well, but the important part is that this changes their outlook. Right? Between the Crusades and between the Mongols, what happens when you're constantly being invaded? You become more conservative, you become more defensive, you become more inward looking. This is the natural pattern that happens in most nations whenever they are under this kind of pressure. And it happens to the Muslim countries. They end up becoming more conservative in outlook. They end up no longer aspiring to art and poetry and literature. They just want survival. They just want things to be stable. They just want things to not go down and just don't change anymore. And this then creates a conservatism that has really persisted almost till today in the Muslim world. So if you want to know why the Muslim world didn't have, the Enlightenment, didn't have Galileo and Newton and all those people, blame the Mongols and blame the Crusades. But of course, the Jewish people who go along in that community are put into the same position. So the economic downturn of the Muslim world, that hurts the Jews who live in the Muslim world. The cultural downturn in the Muslim world, that also means there's a general cultural downturn in the Jewish world. So you stop getting the Jewish poetry the way you used to. You stop getting Jewish art and literature and all these other things. The Jewish scientists are no longer flowering and flourishing because the general culture no longer supports this. When Western exploration, going around Africa and all those and Columbus, when they bypass the Muslim world is hit again because they had been making some of their money by trading, by taking things that were being sold from China and India and taking them to Europe. And that was very profitable for the Muslim world. But once the Europeans can go to China and India directly, now the Muslim world is completely bypassed by the growing cultures and the growing industries of the globe. And so they even more get sort of pushed into the corner. Following that story? Okay. We often call the Jewish communities who are purely of Middle Eastern origin, Mizrahi. So really there are three different main Jewish groups of culture. There's the Ashkenazim, that's the European group. There's the Sephardim, which is the born in Spain and Portugal, but spread throughout North Africa, Greece, Turkey, and parts of Israel. And then there's the Mizrahi, which can sometimes be the Egyptian, the Iraqi, the Persian, the other groups that are further to the east. Good? Good. Like I said, in 1492, it gets much worse with the Spanish expulsion. The Spanish, of course, had been reconquering Spain from the Muslims, who had almost conquered Europe through that entry. And as they did this, they put pressure on the Jewish people to leave or convert. Now, many times in Jewish history, especially in this area, that had been normal. Right? Someone would show up and say, "Oh, I'm the new big man in town. Everybody needs to become Christian. Everybody needs to become Muslim," whoever the new big man in town was. And people would say, yeah, whatever, I'm Christian, or I'm Muslim. And then, 5 years later, the guy would either be dead, or the guy would have moved on, or no one was checking anymore. And you go back to openly being Jewish again. It was just, you went along with the outward in order, and privately you still stay Jewish. And this was the way that you didn't have to keep disrupting your whole life over and over again. This was different. When the Spanish expulsion came, when the Spanish conversion happened, nobody thought it was going to last long, but it did. It's lasted 500 years. It's only recently that Spain officially stopped the Inquisition, the attempt to hunt down people who were pretending to be Christian. And Spain has gone a long way to offering citizenship to the Jews who had been the descendants of the Jews who were kicked out. That's just been happening in the last few years. But for 500 years, what we thought was going to be a short-term, blip in how the rulers were behaving became permanent. And like I said, this is due to that rising religious passion. It's due to that rising cultural identity and nationalism. And that is part of what made it stick longer than all of the previous ones. Like I said, many of the people fled, many to the Middle East, to Greece, Turkey, and other places. Many also went up to the Netherlands, which is why the Netherlands has a very strong Sephardic community and history. Many also went to the New World. So they went to Mexico, they went to Brazil, they went to the new colonies of Spain and Portugal. And the plan was, hey, we'll go there. And when we're there, nobody's going to care about the Inquisition. No one's going to come knocking on the door saying, hey, we heard you light candles on Friday. It'll be easy and we'll just, it's good. Turns out the Inquisition followed them. And they were still persecuted and forced to be Christian. And that's why we now have hundreds of thousands of people who are rediscovering their roots as Jews among the Latin American communities. And many of them are finding their way back to Judaism, which is a beautiful thing. But it's been a long time. It's been 500 years that they've been pushed away because of because of what Spain did. Okay. A little bit later, 1500s, and then really 16 and 1700s, we get what's called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the fancy term for all of those thinkers and people who wanted to invent a better society. This is where the ideas of the American Revolution come from. This is where the ideas for the French Revolution comes from. The idea that we are free, we are equal, we should have liberty, that all people should be able to live their own way, and no one should have to bow to the authority of false institutions. So they began to challenge the church, and they began to challenge the king, and they began to challenge all of the traditions of their communities. And this is, of course, what led to all of the rises in science and the rise of culture and the rise of new industry that made Europe really become the dominant power over the entire planet for the next few hundred years. So what did it do that really changed things? Well, like I said, countries should be organized not around kings, but around identity. And it shouldn't be that I am French because my king is French. I'm French because I am part of the culture of France. This was a new way of thinking. Nowadays, it seems like automatic to us. This was a new idea back then. They also had the new idea that human beings as individuals had inherent dignities, and that individuals then had rights to be protected. The idea of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the things that we call the Bill of Rights in America, these were all born as ideas during this time period. I just want to make sure you understand, this was totally new. Right? You go back 3,000 years ago, no one was talking about the right to free speech. The words wouldn't have even made sense to them back then. Also, critical thinking could solve all our problems. As long as we sit down, we do the research, we use logic, we use math, everybody loved math, we'll be able to solve all of our problems. We've since found out that that doesn't quite work, that people are still emotional and you can't solve emotions with math, but it has made huge progress. And that's why we went to the moon 50 years ago, was because this thinking helped us get there. And proof was more important than authority. You had to prove something if you wanted me to believe it. You couldn't just say, I'm Pope, therefore the moon doesn't have mountains. That didn't work anymore. Right? That was what Galileo's famous discussion was about, and the idea of whether the Earth was in the center of the solar system or the sun. And Copernicus said, look, I've got proof. And the Catholic Church said, we have a Pope. And it turned out that proof was more important than the Pope. These topics all become important for where Judaism goes next to. And they also become important for why anti-Semitism as an official attitude begins during this time period. It might be surprising that with people believing in inherent dignity and people's rights, that anti-Semitism becomes worse during this time period, but it does. So let's get into that. So nationalism, right? The idea that your national identity was the most important part about you was a big part of the Enlightenment project. This is why the French become French, the British become British, the Germans become German. And this was, like I said, partly a replacement for kings and for popes of who you are. And this led to people wanting to define what is my nation, right? Who are the French? Who are the Germans? And that identity, well, if you didn't match it, now you were not just a stranger, you were not part of the nation. You were no longer French. It used to be that a Jewish person was French because their king was called Louis. Now, you're not French even if you live here because you don't act French. You don't follow the same culture that we follow. And that creates a lot more anger and a lot more antagonism. Additionally, because Jews who had been pushed into ghettos were now more foreign than ever, it meant that they often had less in common in many countries than they used to. Back in the Middle Ages, two Jewish people walking down the street in the year 900 and two Christian people walking down the street in the year 900, you wouldn't have been able to tell who was who just by looking. By this point, in the 17 and 1800s, absolutely you could tell the difference just by looking. Their clothes were different, the way they spoke was much different than it had been from each other before. Obviously, the way they were worshiping and the way they were eating and all those things were much more obvious by this point because of that separation and the rise of nationalism. Now, this meant that we had to find a new way to live. And some of the thinkers, some of the Enlightenment people, they said, here's the deal. You Jews, you're weird, you're different, you're strange, but it's not your fault. It's because you've had bad teachers, and it's because we made you live in ghettos, and it's because we always treated you badly. So if you fit in, you'll learn to be like us, and then there won't be a problem. This is what we nowadays would call assimilation. To just fit in and everything will go well. And they meant it, at least many of the thinkers, that if you look like us, you dress like us, you act like us, you eat like us, you speak like us, you can still be Jewish, on Saturday, but for the regular week, you just should look like the rest of us and don't draw attention to yourself. Many of the people of Europe really did mean that then they wouldn't hate Jews anymore. After all, they'd learn to accept Catholics and Protestants. They could learn to accept us as well if we weren't so different, if we weren't always making ourselves seem like we were foreigners there. And the early reform movement agreed. They said yes, using the idea of enlightenment to attack the rabbinic authority of their day, which I have to point out was not as good as it should have been. Right? The rabbinic authority of many of the ghettos had become borderline corrupt. Some places it absolutely was corrupt. So many of the Reform leaders said, look, our local authority isn't very good among the Jews. The Europeans are finally willing to accept us. So now I wear a suit and a top hat rather than I wear what I used to wear. So now I walk down the street and I speak French or German rather than speaking Yiddish or Hebrew. Okay, that's fine, because I didn't like a lot of what my authority was doing. I like Judaism. I still want to be Jewish, but I'm going to get rid of the bad stuff and I'm going to fit in wherever I can. That was their ideas. Now, many Jews said, what are you doing? You're just becoming French. You're just becoming German. You're throwing away Judaism. And this became a reactionary movement that said, we need to stop all changes in the community to prevent this from happening. And we need to make new rules so that people will not be able to escape the community. They won't give up the Judaism we think they should have. That became orthodoxy, the Orthodox. So it's very important for you to note that both Orthodoxy and the Reform movement began in the 1800s. Right? Reform did not leave Orthodoxy. Reform caused Orthodoxy. Right? Before the Reform movement, before the Orthodox movement, there were just a pile of Jews. And when the Reform movement began, part of the pile that was left made a new group and said, we're not going to do that. We're going to make new rules that will prevent anyone from changing. And that became Orthodoxy. The conservative movement, we came later. We were about 50 years behind. So we weren't right there at the beginning. And then there were others who said, look, we're never going to fit in. The Germans don't really like us. Even if I act just like a perfect German, I'm not going to fit in. This was seen most famously in the Dreyfus case in France, where Theodor Herzl, who is considered to be the father of the modern state of Israel, saw that a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason, and he was attacked for being Jewish. But the officer wasn't like Orthodox. It wasn't like he was, the cartoon Jew. He was a Frenchman in every way. He was just a regular French officer who was being falsely accused of treason and was being treated worse because he happened to be Jewish. And that's where Theodor Herzl, who was fairly assimilated at the time, said they're never going to accept us. No matter what we do, Europe will always dislike us because we're Jews, even if we look exactly like them. So what do we need to do? We need to have our own nation. We need to have our own country. We need to have Israel. This is the birth of Zionism, of the idea that there should be a movement back to the land of Israel to build a new state there that would be a Jewish state. So then you would have a German state, you'd have a French state, you'd have a British state, you'd have a Jewish state, that it would just be a normal country like all the other countries of the world. And his belief, then they'll stop hating us. That part didn't work out, but we do have him to thank that with his dream, it did make Israel a modern state possible. How are we doing? Okay. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with now, modernity, the contemporary world. We have seen the worst of nationalism in Germany with Nazism, with the Holocaust. We have seen how dark nationalism can get. We have seen the peak of Zionism when 1948, Israel became a state. And I remind you, you can check the videos I did earlier on the beginning of the modern state of Israel. We have seen large-scale assimilation. Every year, we lose more Jews to nothing than we do to any other problem. That they just stop being Jewish. They just stop identifying. They stop acting as Jews. They stop thinking of themselves as Jews. They just disappear into the community around us. That is still probably the largest problem that we have. And each of the three movements, the Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative movements, are all fighting that, but we each have different methods for fighting it, which if you go back to our second video this year, which was about the movements, you'll see more about that. We have seen enormous growth in Jewish learning of all communities. So even though there's so much assimilation, the Jews who are still Jewish are doing more and learning more and knowing more than probably at any point in Jewish history, because there are more schools now, there are more ways to learn now, books are cheaper now, and people are engaging more now, like you, than ever before in Jewish history. And so more Jews are more knowledgeable and more active than they used to be, and more Jews are disappearing. it's this very weird world that we live in right now. We have also seen that the many varieties of Orthodoxy have continued to move to be more and more isolationist, to have their communities be more and more focused only on their own group, rather than connecting to the Jewish world, and certainly not connecting to the rest of the modern world. There are parts of this country where you have Orthodox Jews who primarily speak Yiddish, and English is still their second language, even though their families have lived here for 3 or maybe 4 generations. But they have cut themselves off from the American communities. We have also seen the conservative movement try to capture the organic blend of tradition and modernity. That's our call, which we believe that, yes, the Enlightenment kicked over how the communities worked, and we're trying to sort of put it back in place where it can have a natural conversation of, this is what tradition has, this is what the modern world is doing, how do we use the wisdom and the rules of tradition to help us live in the modern world, not to separate them, and certainly not to say the modern world is in charge and Judaism will just, match everything. That there needs to be a conversation between the modern world and the traditional wisdom. And we haven't seen the end of the story. We are going to keep going, and we'll see what the next century brings. Okay, so that's it for the history. Like I said, fast. Any quick questions? Obviously, there are lots of deep questions. All right, so let's get to the days of mourning. All right, our sad reflections. There are a number of days that are especially sad throughout the Jewish calendar that are called that are fast days. Fast days, as we're going to see, is famous for not eating, but there are other things we do on these days too. So, what are they? Well, what's that? The 9th of Av. Well, we're going to get there, right? We're going to get to the 9th of Av, but there's actually an order of how these days come, and maybe you can see what it is. On the 10th of Tevet, which is in the winter time, there's the commemoration of the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. That is the day when the Babylonian army came up to the walls of Jerusalem and the final battle began. On the 17th of Tammuz, which just happened a few weeks ago, a week and a half ago, something like that, on the 17th of Tammuz, that was when there was the breach of the walls by Babylonians. So at this point, it's like 6 months later, they finally break through the wall, and now the soldiers are coming into the city of Jerusalem. The fighting continues, and the Jewish soldiers end up on the Temple Mount as like their final place of defiance, and that's where we'll get to in the next one. But on this day, the 17th of Tammuz, which was, like I said, the breach of Jerusalem walls, it also happened to be the same day, according to our tradition, that the first tablets brought down by Moses were broken. Remember the story of the golden calf? Moses throws down the tablets. That happened on the same day. It's also when the Seleucids, those were the enemies that we fought in the Maccabee Wars. We talked about that a little bit last week in a quick flow. That's when they burnt the first Torah scroll as they tried to destroy Judaism. It's also the day that an idol was erected in the temple. So it's a bad day. Now, these 2 days are what we call daytime fasts, which means that the restrictions on eating and drinking and other things are just from sunup till the stars come out. So it's not a full day, it's just during the daytime. This is actually very similar to the Muslim practice during Ramadan, which is also to have restrictions on what you do only during the daytime hours. Make sense? Okay, now, as Mar mentioned, after they break through the walls, a few days later, 3 weeks later, they finally destroy the temple. And this is on the 9th day of Av, what we call Tisha B'Av. Now, what does Tisha B'Av mean? 9th of Av. It's not a fancy name. It's just a literal name for the calendar day. Think of it like the 4th of July, but the absolute worst day rather than the happiest day. Why? Because on this day, both the first and second temples were destroyed, and it was decreed that the generation who left Egypt would not enter Israel. Remember, after the spy incident. And it was the fall and massacre of Beitar, which was the last Bar Kokhba stronghold in the revolt against Rome in 136 CE. And it was the day when the Romans plowed the Temple Mount into desolation and destroyed everything that was up there. There were no longer even any ruins. And it was the day that the first Crusades were declared by the Pope in 1095. And it was the day that the Jews were expelled from England in 1290. And it was the day when the Spanish expulsion of 1492 happened. And it was the day World War I began. And it was the day when the removal of the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto began, when they were taken to the death camps during the Holocaust. And most recently, it was the day of the bombing in Buenos Aires of the JCC, when about 100 people were killed in 1994. What?
I remember this.
You remember this?
Yeah.
All of these things happened on the same day. Right? It's a bad day, right? And when we mourn on Tisha B'Av, we are mourning for all of this. That's why Tisha B'Av is a full fast day, which means from before nightfall until the next nightfall, all of the restrictions are in place. So it's like a full 25 hours that we have our limits. And we're going to talk about what those limits are in just a second. Tisha B'Av is one of only two full fast days. The other full fast day is, of course, Yom Kippur. But they have totally different emotions. Tisha B'Av is sad and miserable. Yom Kippur is intense and it is exhausting, but it is also uplifting. So they have very different feelings. So just because they're fast days doesn't mean they have the same attitude. Yom Kippur should never feel sad. Okay, so we have one more day in this cycle, which is the 3rd of Tishrei, which happens to be the day after the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And this is called Tzom Gedalia. It's in honor of Gedaliah, who was the last governor of Judea under the Babylonians. He was still kind of sort of in charge. I mean, he was a puppet of the Babylonians, but Jewish terrorists killed him. They assassinated him because, you're working with the Babylonians. But he was just trying to make peace after the destruction. After the temple had been destroyed, he was just trying to help rebuild the country. And these Jewish fanatics assassinated him. And when they killed him, the Babylonians went, all right, fine, everybody out. And this is where the exile to Babylon began, where they took so many of our people and took us all the way to Babylon, where we would be stuck for another 70 years. And this was the last tragedy in the whole cycle that began with the siege that finished with the governor being murdered. Following? And this is also a daytime fast. Okay, so they all fit together, you might have noticed, with near the end, with a 3-week period from the 17th of Tammuz. Remember, that was the breaking of the walls of Jerusalem, until the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which was the destruction of the temple. There are 3 weeks that are during that time period. This was when the fighting was most intense. This was when the murder was worst. And so during that time, it's the Ashkenazic custom to not have any marriages and not to cut hair, right? So I'm waiting for another week or a week and a half until I can get my hair cut and trim my beard. Because if you remember from when we talked about mourning, not cutting our hair is a sign of being in mourning. After a loved one dies, we go through a period for 30 days of not having haircuts, not shaving if you're a man, and that sort of thing. And of course, how could we possibly dance at a wedding during this time when we're remembering these terrible disasters? Now, this is officially found more strongly within the Ashkenazic world, but the Sephardim and Mizrahi also do usually observe this as well. There are some differences depending upon the community, but in general, this is observed. Now, from Rosh Chodesh Av, which begins tonight and tomorrow, until Tisha B'Av, so that's the last 9 days of this time period, we continue with not having marriages, not having weddings. We're still married. We're not having weddings and not cutting hair, but there are also some other customs depending upon your community. So many people will no longer wear freshly pressed clothes, because that happened very rarely in the ancient world, and it was always for trying to look fancy. Who can look fancy during this time? They also would do no laundry. Again, laundry back then was different than laundry now. Laundry back then, you didn't do it all the time. It was only for special occasions. Yeah, that's why. People wouldn't do any bathing for pleasure. Hygiene, in order to, like, if you're out with the horses, you certainly can wash yourself up after that, but people didn't just go to the hot springs during this time period. And for many people, they even would say during this time, we're not going to eat meat. Now, we're going to get to the very end of whether or not we need to continue some of these restrictions. Like I said, I do still don't cut my hair, and I still don't shave. I follow the custom in the Ashkenazic world that says we don't eat meat for the 9 days, but we do eat meat on Shabbat, because on Shabbat we should still be happy. And I'm sorry to any vegetarians, but meat makes people happy. But that's simply part of our biology. It doesn't mean that you have to eat meat, but please understand that God understands that we like meat. Okay, but we'll come back to more. So what are the restrictions that are still definitely there on Tisha B'Av? So this is for the day of Tisha B'Av itself. So no eating, no drinking. That's right. 25 hours, you're not eating, you're not even taking a sip of water. All of these, by the way, if you have a medical need, certainly you can do. So if your doctor tells you you have to eat or you have to drink when you take a certain pill, then you eat or you drink whatever your doctor tells you you need to do. But for somebody who's in good health, they don't eat, they don't drink. We don't wear leather shoes. Leather shoes were considered to be a sign of arrogance in the ancient world. Most people in regular work or in regular life would just wear shoes that were made out of flax or reeds or cloth or other things. And leather was like, ooh, look at me. So even though leather shoes now are no big deal, we still don't wear leather shoes. This is a day when you'll see a lot of Crocs. Because that tends to be people's backup. Well, it's not just sneakers.
Sneakers that are made from
cloth.
canvas.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is because a lot of this is actually one of my. It's how I see how the Jewish mind works and where it can go wrong. Is I'll see a lot of people come to synagogue on Tisha B'Av wearing tennis shoes, but the tennis shoes have big leather pieces on them, and it's like, why? It's like, well, because when they were little, they remember their grandfather wouldn't wear leather shoes on Tisha B'Av. So what were sports shoes made out of back in the 50s and 60s? They were made out of canvas, right? Like the Converse shoes you can still get. So they remember not the canvas, they remember they wore sports shoes. And so now they wear sports shoes, not realizing that our sports shoes are mostly made with leather now. So you have to understand why you're doing something to make sure you end up still doing the right thing. So it's no leather shoes. So yes, even some Crocs, by the way, nowadays have leather on them. So you have to be careful. No bathing or washing for pleasure, only for hygiene or ritual purity. No anointing for pleasure, again, only hygiene or medical reasons. In the ancient world, it was like putting on perfumes and things like that. And nowadays, still, we wouldn't be putting perfume on, but if there is some ointment you need to use because eczema or some other skin condition, of course, you can still do that. And no marital relations. That is the gentle way of saying we don't have sex with our spouse. Yes.
Orthodox communities, they have another prohibition: travel for pleasure, for vacation, or something like that.
So in general, we diminish our fun activities, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a question of travel in particular; it's a question of what counts as fun. So, for example, going to the movies, not something you would want to do on Tisha B'Av, right? Because that would generally be considered a fun outing. Seeing a live concert, definitely something we don't do on Tisha B'Av.
But what they do is actually those 9 days from today to 1st of Av to 9th of Av.
Right.
No travel for vacation or only for business.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so that's one thing that we should recognize, that even on Tisha B'Av, work is still permitted. If you saw the videos or you were here when we discussed Shabbat, you'll know that on most Jewish holidays, we're not allowed to work, right? I'm not allowed to light candles on Shabbat. I light candles before Shabbat. I can't cook on Shabbat. I cook before Shabbat. On Tisha B'Av, no, work is still allowed. So you can go to your office and you can work. You're going to be miserable, but you are still allowed to do that. However, on Tisha B'Av, there's some other very special restrictions. We don't give greetings. Normally when you see someone, it's, hi, how are you doing? What's up? On Tisha B'Av, nope. On Tisha B'Av, everything is shut down. It is as though we are struck silent because of our grief. People will sit on the floor or will sit on low stools. This is, again, something that is done during the grieving process when somebody is a mourner, during Shiva. We don't wear tefillin or talit gadol. That's the big talit, and tefillin are the boxes on the arm and the head. We don't wear those in the morning on Tisha B'Av. We only wear them in the afternoon because those are considered to be like adornment. They're like almost like jewelry that God gave us, that we can feel great and wonderful. We're not supposed to feel great and wonderful, but we also don't want to miss the mitzvah, so we just put it off a little bit. So this gives us the combination of feelings. We also don't study on Tisha B'Av, right? We wouldn't be having this class on Tisha B'Av. We wouldn't be having my lunch and learn on Tisha B'Av, because studying in general is enjoyable. It is pleasurable. It is good to study and something we look forward to. And that's not the right mood for Tisha B'Av. Now, you can read Job, which is depressing. You can read Echa, the book of Lamentations, which is actually officially read on Tisha B'Av by the community. And you can read parts of Jeremiah, which are especially, well, not just depressing, but reminding us of our problems. So, yes, everything is designed to make the day as miserable as possible. But one of the things that's beautiful about that is we've made one super miserable day rather than being miserable every day, right? Rather than having 100 different commemorations for all of the different tragedies that we've had throughout all of our history, which you saw, there were a lot of problems in many different communities. We've got one day where we take all of our grief, all of our sadness, pile it on top of itself, and make that one day rotten. And that allows us to grieve so that we do confront our emotions and our sadness, but it also allows us 364 days where we don't have that same intense level of grief, so that we can live and we can experience the joys of life and we can do all of the other things that make life so much more worth living. So it is a very clever balance, and one that our sages say, thank God that God put all of our catastrophes on one day so that we can bundle them up, do it once, and then move on. So what do we do to remember this destruction all year? Well, there's different customs in different communities, but these are some that you might see. So some people will leave 1 cubit of space. A cubit is about here to here of space unpainted in their house, sort of to say, my house can't be perfect if God's house is still destroyed. If the temple is still in ruins, how can my house be so beautiful? So leaving a little bit of it, just a little bit undone. Often this is done opposite the doorway in the house, but that's not required. Some people, including Rambam, would say you couldn't have any ornate, fancy decorations at all on your walls. Most people do not follow that opinion. Many people will leave an empty place at a table. Many people will leave jewelry sets incomplete. Again, I can't be fancy and adorned 100% if our people still have this catastrophe. Many people will put ashes on the forehead of a groom because on the day of your wedding, that is your happiest day. You should recognize that your happiness cannot be 100% complete with the world still being broken at this time. This is also what, by the way, where the custom of breaking a glass comes from. That we are reminding ourselves by destroying a valuable piece of glass, it doesn't have to be valuable, but glass used to be much more expensive. We are reminding ourselves that we can't, even when we are most happy, think that there is nothing left to fix in this world. Right? There are still problems, chief among them all of the destruction that has happened over the 3,000 years. And in the ancient world, someone would also tear their clothes when they saw Jerusalem in its destroyed form. Nowadays, with Jerusalem not destroyed, most people do not observe that practice. As we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, the modern state of Israel has made many of our mourning practices a little out of balance because, thank God, we have Israel. We'll get there. All right, so why why were the temples destroyed? What message can we learn from this other than history has been horrible? You may note that the other catastrophes, the expulsion from Spain, the destruction of the Crusades, the bombing of the JCC, we don't blame ourselves for those. Those were other people doing bad things. However, the first and second temple, those were our fault. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Babylonians were bad and the Romans were bad, but we also made it easy for them by the way we were behaving. So, according to the Talmud, why was the first temple destroyed? Because of three evils. Because of idolatry, immorality, that means like adultery and incest, and bloodshed, murder. Those were the three main problems in our country at the time. And God said, if that's the way you're going to behave, then why should my temple still be here, right? It's just, you have corrupted your own society from within. But why was the second temple destroyed, the one destroyed by the Romans? Seeing that during the time it stood, people occupied themselves with Torah, the observance of mitzvot, and with the practice of tzedakah. So we were better during the time of the second temple. There wasn't as much bloodshed, there wasn't as much immorality, and there was almost hardly any idolatry. We had improved a lot over the last 400 years between the 500 years between the first temple and the second temple. So why was the second one destroyed? Because during the time it stood, sinat chinam prevailed. Right? Sinat chinam means baseless hatred, that people hated each other for no reason. It was just anger and factionalism and nastiness between different people and different groups, neighbor against neighbor, political party against political party, and it was done with such poison, with such hate that had no justification for it, that tore apart our society. And this is to teach you that sinat chinam, that this type of hatred is deemed as grave, as bad as the three sins of idolatry, immorality, and murder altogether. So you may think, hating other people and being horrible to them, that's not such a big deal. And this is reminding us that is just as bad as if you were to murder someone or sleep with someone else's spouse or worship an idol, right? That hatred is one of the worst things that we can have in our community. Something to remember in the modern world where hatred seems to be very popular and sells well. Okay. So how do we actually mourn? Why all of these restrictions? Why not more? Why not less? There's a wonderful discussion about this in the Talmud. So the rabbis taught, when the second temple was destroyed, many of Israel, many of the Jewish people stopped eating meat and drinking wine all the time. 100%, no more meat, no more wine. This was what they felt they needed to do. So Rabbi Joshua, no relation, Rabbi Joshua said to them, my children, why do you not eat meat and drink wine? And they replied, should we eat meat of which sacrifices were brought, or drink wine which was offered at the altar? So they're saying, the temple was destroyed, and that's where they had meat because of the sacrifices. That's where they had wine because of the offerings of the libations. I can't eat that. If the temple's destroyed, I shouldn't have it either. Right? This was their way of grieving for the destruction. So Rabbi Joshua said, okay, if so, then we shouldn't eat bread, as the meal offering, the grain offering, was also gone. And they said, fine, we won't eat bread. We can live on fruit alone. And he said, but there was also the first fruit offering. And they said, okay, then we won't eat fruit. Right? We're going to be just eating vegetables, I guess. And he said, but wasn't it also the custom to have water on the altar during the water libation in Sukkot, which the altar is no longer there? Basically, so you're not going to drink water anymore either? And they were silent. Right? So he shut them up because they realized finally that if you try to mourn completely for the destruction that happened, you end up killing yourself. You will end up losing life. You will end up being able to live in this world. That grief cannot be all-consuming. There has to be a limit. So he went on, and Rabbi Joshua said to them, my children, come and listen to me. It would be wrong not to mourn at all. Right? We can't pretend like a bad thing didn't happen. It did, right? Because the evil decree is executed. But to mourn too much is also impossible, as there must not be decreed a prohibition for the congregation which they could not stand. This is a very important principle in Judaism, which is that when the rabbis try to interpret the law and implement it for the community, they can't make it so harsh or so difficult that the community can't live up to it. Right? You would be deliberately leading the community to break the edict then. So, therefore, the sages said, as we talked about, when one paints his house, he leaves a part unpainted. When one prepares the needs for his meal, he leaves something out as a sign of mourning. And the same is the case with a woman. She may dress with all her ornaments, leaving out some of that which is unimportant for that purpose. Right? Just leave a little bit undone. Don't destroy life because of your grief, but also don't pretend like nothing ever happened. Right? By the way, this is very good advice for any type of grief. That, of course, you have to mourn, and of course, there has to be a limit to mourning. So, Rav Ishmael bar Elisha said, from the day when the temple was destroyed, it would only be right that we should take upon ourselves not to eat meat and drink wine, but such a thing, which the majority of the congregation could not endure, must not be decreed. So he tried to summarize that for his generation as well, that sure, it probably would feel right to completely cut this out of our life, because then we would be acting as sad as we sometimes feel. But if we did that, most of us would not be able to stand it. So we don't. We still allow it. Now, I don't want to end on the downer note. So Zechariah comes along, the prophet Zechariah, and he says, and the word of the Lord of hosts came to me saying, thus said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the fourth month, that's the 17th of Tammuz, the one we just had a week and a half or so ago, and the fast of the fifth month, that's Tisha B'Av, coming up in 9 days, and the fast of the 7th, which is the 3rd of Tishrei, Tzom Gedalia, and the fast of the 10th of Tevet, the winter fast day. These shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness and cheerful feasts. Therefore love truth and peace. What he's talking about is when the days of the Messiah come, when the day of restoration is at hand, all of these 4 fast days are going to be flipped to be days of rejoicing. So in the end, these are going to become 4 holidays rather than 4 mourning days. But what do we do in the meantime? That's the question. Well, Rav Papa said, I love Rav Papa, when there is peace, meaning when there is final 100% peace, then these days will be times of joy and gladness. Then we will completely reverse them. When there is persecution, they are days of fasting, right? When the world is terrible, we fast. When there is no persecution, but still no peace, if you are in the in-between time, if people wish, they fast, and if they wish, they do not fast. This doesn't count for Tisha B'Av, according to all of the commentators, but for the other days, if somebody wants to fast, they do. If they don't want to fast, they don't. In the no persecution and no peace. This has led many commentators, myself included, to say in 2019, where we have a beautiful and a mostly secure state of Israel that is not likely to be destroyed by her enemies anytime soon, we have to, and where most Jews live in France or Germany or England or America or Canada or Latin America, we are not persecuted. I mean, yes, there are some individual crazies out there, and we are reminded of that too often. But most governments do not hunt Jews anymore. Most governments do not hurt Jews anymore in the countries where most Jews live. We can't really pretend like we're being persecuted the way Jews were persecuted just 100 years ago. So if we are fasting with 100% intensity on those other days, it's almost as though we are not admitting the miracle that we are living in now of a modern world that is mostly free and peaceful for most of us, and is getting more free and peaceful for other humans as well. We have to recognize that the world is headed the right direction. Still has some parts that need a lot of work. Sometimes things will go up and down, but the general trend is getting better and better. And we are much better off than it used to be. So for the other days, not Tisha B'Av, but for the other days, I certainly understand if a person wants to be more relaxed. Now, should it be like a wild, happy day? No. We still have to remember that the world is in the balance, right? It's not bad, it's not finished, but we shouldn't pretend like it's one or the other. Make sense? Okay. Oh, yep. Yeah, that's it. That was the end. Yeah.
Some people fast on these days on the half day.
Some people will fast only for the half day. Some people only fast half day because of medical reasons as well. Some people will do less if they live in Israel, and they'll do more if they live outside of Israel. There are many customs that we are beginning to explore because this is a new situation. Like we saw from our whole discussion of Jewish history, the freedom that we have now, the safety that we have now, this is kind of new. I mean, really, even during the days of King Solomon and King David, most people didn't live with as much comfort and as much peace and as much safety as we do today. It's kind of a miracle. Whether or not we are at the edge of bringing the Messiah to this world, I can't say. I'm not a prophet, right? Maybe, maybe not. But whatever happens tomorrow, I'm thankful for today. I'm thankful for being able to live at this time. I will remember Tisha B'Av and the other catastrophes that have happened to our people, because we do have to be sad. We do have to shed tears for all of the pain that it has taken to get here, and to remember that we're not finished yet, right? The world is not completely redeemed. There is still far too much suffering that needs to be taken care of. But I need to see that we live in between. Now, with that in mind, I will remind you that next Saturday night, not this coming week, but the following Saturday night, as well as next Sunday, the community will be joining together, meaning the whole Orlando community will join together this year over at Ohev Shalom for Tisha B'Av services. So we'll be there in the evening, and then we'll be back there in the morning for the reading of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. In the morning we read from the Torah, and this is a way for the community to come together. And it's I believe, very important, because as you saw, one of the problems we've had in our history is the communities have not always stuck together. And especially on Tisha B'Av, we need to be together. And yes, everyone has their own choice. Everyone has their own preference. Everyone can be at this synagogue or that synagogue or this type of Jew or that type of Jew. But especially on Tisha B'Av, we stop the arguing and we stick together.
And that's also where it starts the fasting.
Saturday night, yes, exactly. Because we don't fast on Shabbat. Yes.
Shabbat, then we start the fasting.
Exactly.
The next day until the sun goes down.
Until the next day, until 3 stars come out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So you have to wait until the new day has completely begun, which is with 3 stars.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Shabbat, we begin early on a regular week when the sun goes down to make sure that we don't accidentally trip on the edge of Shabbat. But for a regular day, 3 stars is when it starts.
What if it's cloudy?
So if it's cloudy, but you know what time the sun went down, if you know when the sun went down yesterday, usually you can add about 45 minutes to that and you'll be okay.
It's about 25 hours.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, from start to finish, about 25 hours. Nowadays we have apps. You'll also see in our handout in the service handout will also tell you when Havdalah, when the end of the day is. So there are plenty of ways to find out, even if it's cloudy. But in the old world, you just waited extra if you couldn't see and be sure. But people were good at telling time by the light of the sky, even when it was cloudy back then, because you had to be. No one had one of these.
Okay, so the service that is going to be on Saturday night, it
Yes.
will be the same on Sunday morning?
It'll be very similar.
Very similar.
Yes. I mean, Sunday morning, of course, because it's a morning service, there'll be different parts to the service, including a Torah reading. But in the evening, it'll be a little bit shorter, but the main event will be still the chanting of the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha. That'll happen both morning and evening.
Yeah. That's good to know, because I was thinking to go on Sunday morning. So that's why I'm asking if it's the same. No, but you say it's just a few different.
There are differences, yes. I mean, one's an evening service plus the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha. The other is a morning service plus Torah reading and the book of Lamentations. So they are similar, but not the same.
Now, I have another question.
Yes.
Like tomorrow, I'm coming for the Friday dinner Shabbat?
Yes.
Okay. If I want to light up my candles in my house,
Yes.
I can do it way before I come here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And do my prayers and everything?
Yep. Because you can't light them after Shabbat
After
begins,
Shabbat.
but you can light earlier than Shabbat begins. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. You
Thank
can.
you.
You can just don't light them on Thursday.
No, I already have that.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, because the last month,
Mhm.
I came for the Friday dinner Shabbat.
Right.
So I was expecting that over here, they were gonna light up the candles.
Right. Now, I mean, that
And then you explained me that why you guys don't do it, because it's more at home.
exactly right. It's the primary point of having the candles lit is for the home that you're in. As I mentioned in our class on Shabbat, the lighting of the candles is not just symbolic; it's practical, because you need to have light in your house, or else you're going to be unhappy. As anybody who has ever stubbed their toe in the dark knows. Nowadays, yes, we have electric light, and as we talked about, electricity in that form is fine under conservative Judaism, but still lighting the candles as a way of saying, I am preparing for Shabbat, because joy doesn't happen by itself. Right? Joy is not like some random thing like rain. Joy needs a little bit of preparation, and you need to make room for it to happen. And if you don't, then don't be surprised if it doesn't show up.
Question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
When I was in Israel,
Mm-hmm.
on Shabbat, they have a particular elevator.
Yes.
They don't.
Right.
And
So-
they
so-
don't.
Right. So among the Orthodox, they still believe that electricity shouldn't be used on Shabbat. But they also know that many people live in apartment buildings and hotels, and climbing 50 flights of stairs on Shabbat is not exactly a fun activity for Shabbat. So the compromise that they've come up with for some communities is to have an elevator that will just go to every floor
Yes.
for a little bit on each floor. And so it's just an automatic elevator. And that gets turned on before Shabbat begins, and then it gets turned off after Shabbat finishes. Like I mentioned, in the conservative movement, we do not see in the regular use of electricity for most things a violation of Shabbat, because electricity by itself is not a problem. How you use it can be a problem, right? So using an electric typewriter or using your printer, that's a problem, because that's just like writing. Using your electric stove, that's a problem, because that's cooking, and cooking is definitely prohibited. Using an electric light, you're not violating one of the other labors, one of the melachot of Shabbat, and therefore it's not prohibited. And an elevator, again, all it's doing is going, vroom, vroom. There's no actual work being done that would be prohibited by Jewish law. So this is one of the differences of opinion between us and the Orthodox.
Also, when it wasn't, we were still in Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
And where is the market there?
Which one?
The Jewish market. There was a rabbi with this big hat,
Right?
and
Yeah.
every time a car passed,
Uh-huh.
he said, no, he was saying like, Shabbat, I don't know.
Shabbos.
Shabbos,
Yeah.
Shabbos, every time a car
Yes.
passed.
So again, within the Orthodox world, they are very much opposed to any driving on Shabbat. And some of them will resort to violence. Others will simply resort to name calling, which is kind of what that person was doing. The part that is painful is there's no way he knew that the driver of that car was Jewish. Right? The driver of the car could have been Christian, could have been Muslim. They weren't necessarily Jewish. So it's not really his place to condemn someone that you don't know, someone who could be rushing to the hospital, someone who could have a legitimate maybe he's been called up for military right then, he's got to go and get his rifle and help. I mean, if you don't know what the person is doing, you can't condemn them. Unfortunately, driving is one of those topics that has become sort of a banner waving cause in many communities. And I've been in communities where part of the preparation before Shabbat is you get rocks together so that if a car comes into your street, you can throw rocks at the car. Now, throwing the rock is also a violation of Shabbat, but that they think is okay because it is somehow protecting Shabbat. It is crazy. I'm sorry. I mean, I do try to be respectful of different branches of Judaism, and the fact that they have their interpretation of Jewish law, I respect completely. But when their interpretation involves doing violence to another person unnecessarily, right? This isn't a war. This isn't a policeman or something. Then that's gone too far. You are now breaking the law to save the law, and when you think that you're right to endanger a person, which is one of the worst things you can do in Judaism, then you've simply gone nuts.
So then they're going for legalities.
Legalities, yeah.
Legalities instead of just the law.
It's more, remember our discussion a little bit, just very briefly today, about how the Orthodox world wanted to keep the modern world out. This is part of that process. It's not a question of they like the law more than we like the law or anything like that. There are certain issues that they consider to be the most important barriers against the influence of the modern world. And one of those is driving on Shabbat, because in this way they are right.
Their community.
No, in general. In this way they are right.
They don't do this only in their community.
In their neighborhoods, yeah,
Neighborhoods.
right. So let me point out that they are both right, but they're wrong in the way they attack it, right? Because they're right in the sense that the car, right, and the automobile has destroyed traditional neighborhoods. And I don't just mean Orthodox neighborhoods. I mean any neighborhood. Once people were able to drive, they didn't need to live near the city. They didn't need to live near the butcher shop. They didn't need to live near their school. Now I can live 10 miles away, right? And I can have a house that has a huge yard, so I don't even see my neighbors, let alone, hear them. And I don't meet them, and I don't know them. The cars, stay in the garage. I get in my car, I leave the house, I shut the garage. I never see anybody else in my neighborhood, and everyone else does the same. The only people who know each other in a neighborhood today are the people who walk their dogs, right? No one else knows anyone.
That's true.
And the Orthodox understood that if you could drive to the synagogue, or if you could drive anywhere on Shabbat, that people would move away from the center of the community. And that they were right. One of the biggest problems that the conservative movement still has is most of our congregants don't live close to the synagogue, because most people just bought their house like you ever buy your house. You buy it according to how long you can drive somewhere from it, not how far you can walk from it. Now, with that being said, I don't think you should throw rocks at people, right? Encouraging people to live closer, encouraging people to meet their neighbors, encouraging people to build those relationships. That is the solution, in my opinion, not a pile of rocks. But we'll leave it.
The problem is, at least in Israel, or even in here, in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
I know that they have those communities
that try to block off the streets,
Yeah, the
which
streets.
is illegal, but
But what you have is, like in Israel, you have Jews, Israelis, that they don't care about nothing,
Right.
And they would try to drive this through these streets, and that's why those piles of rocks.
So it is a complicated issue. But when it comes to violence against other people that you disagree with, that is sinat chinam. That is the baseless hatred that we were talking about that led to the destruction of the Second Temple. As soon as you think, I disagree with you enough that I'm willing to kill you in your car, then you have gone too far. And that is part of what is keeping suffering alive in our world. All right, we'll leave it there. But remember, positive.
Mar, in Miami, you're gonna find